Okay, so the context of this talk, why are we talking about the cause of obesity? And the context is pretty simple. There's an obesity epidemic in the works. You guys know the numbers. You've seen them. Obesity rates in this country have increased 2.5-fold since the early 1970s. It goes along with the diabetes epidemic. Diabetes rates, if you want to go back to the 1960s and you believe the CDC numbers, diabetes prevalence in this country has increased 9-fold in 50 years, which is terrifying, okay? So why do I put this up here? Imagine we were talking about HIV and AIDS mortality, and the cause of HIV was established beyond reasonable doubt in the mid-80s. The cause of AIDS is the HIV virus, and then mortality and incidence, prevalence continued to go up like this. There would be national investigations by the CDC, the NIH, and every university in the country to try and understand what is it we don't understand about the cause of AIDS. Because we assume that if we can establish the cause of a disease, we then know how to treat it. We can keep the Ebola virus, we think, under control because we know what causes Ebola. Okay, but a graph like this, or the obesity epidemic like that, suggests that maybe there's something about the cause of this disease that we don't get. Maybe we are misconceiving the etiology of this disease. Because what I'm going to put forth is that if we understood it, it wouldn't look like this. And we can blame the food environment, and we could blame the public and people for not listening, but fundamentally you should be asking yourself, this happened, like if you're faculty here, this happened under your watch. Okay? Maybe you missed something. So the role I played in all this is as the gadfly journalist who comes along and says, maybe we missed something, and I get to spend basically 10 years of my life going back in history, going through all the literature, looking to see what we might have missed that could explain this and why we've completely failed to control this disease and obesity. And so the lecture you're going to get is what I learned. And it's supposed to be very thought-provoking. I hope the response I get is just this is interesting and that I don't expect you to agree with me, but I hope it at least gives you a different perspective and makes you think maybe there's something to this. So before we go on, there's one more thing to keep in mind. The talk is on obesity, but as we know, obesity associates with a whole close host of metabolic diseases: stroke, heart disease, gallbladder, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, of course, hypertension, neurodegeneration, fatty liver disease, which is epidemic now. Neurodegeneration, by the way, includes Alzheimer's, most cancers. And the conventional wisdom is this, that as you get fatter, something about the condition of being fatter or gaining weight, maybe the inflammatory molecules released, increases the risk of all these diseases. So the causal pathway goes from getting fatter this way. And what I'm proposing, this alternative hypothesis that comes out of this 10 years of gadfly research, is that the same thing that causes obesity also causes these metabolic disorders. So this lecture could be called Why We Get Sick instead of Why We Get Fat. I use obesity because it's a lot easier to make the argument than obesity, and I don't leave myself up to too much of an accusation that I cherry pick my data. Okay, so what's the conventional wisdom? What makes us fat? Every organization in the world, for all intensive purposes, has some variation of this. The fundamental cause of obesity and overweight is an energy imbalance between calories consumed, calories expended, which is the line you see in the research literature, is that obesity is an energy balance disorder. Calories in greater than calories out, we store fat. It's pretty simple. We overeat, very simple way to put it. The biblical way to put it would be gluttony and sloth are the causes of the disorder. Then you have to, one of the things we want to do in science, right, is explain the observation. So you can think about science as trying to find the causes of the things we see in nature. What we're seeing right now are an obesity epidemic and a diabetes epidemic. So how do we explain that by this energy balance hypothesis? And the conventional wisdom, Marion Nessel at NYU back in 2002, the way she put it, she said increased prosperity is driving the epidemic. Kelly Brown, now at Yale, now at Duke, described it as sort of toxic, obesogenic environment. And this is how it was described by Kelly: cheeseburgers and French fries, drive-in windows and supersizes, soft drinks and candy, potato chips, et cetera, once unusual, are as much our background as trees, grass, and clouds. Few children walk or bike to school. There's little physical education. Computers, video games, and TVs keep children inside and inactive. Parents are reluctant to let children roam free to play. So the basis is, And by the way, I'm talking fast because I have a lot of ground to cover, not because I'm trying to sell you something, although I am trying to sell you something. The basis is all these factors came together to increase our intake and decrease our expenditure. So here's the general hypothesis. Too much food, too little physical activity causes overeating, energy in greater than energy out. The result is obesity and the obesity epidemic. So my question for you is, how many of you believe this is true, or reasonably true? Okay, good. I actually gave this talk at Tufts, and I asked that question, and nobody raised their hands. I thought I must have thrown in a double negative. And I thought, okay, I can leave, because nobody believes it, at Tufts of all places. I'm going to try and convince you that not only is this wrong, it's not even wrong. It's meaningless, okay? Literally senseless. And that this is the single greatest mistake made in the history of science. I know it sounds crazy hubristic to say that, but I'm going to try and convince you that this is the case. And we're going to start by just asking the question. We're going to say this is a hypothesis. Okay, it may seem like it was written on stone and passed down on tablets, but it's a hypothesis. And like any hypothesis, we could try and look for counterexamples, black swans. Okay, so one of the things I did in the course of my 10 years of research is I went through the literature looking for populations that had high levels of obesity, but none of this toxic obesogenic environment on which we blame obesity in the US today. And not surprisingly, you can find quite a few of them. Okay, so here's about a dozen that I found. This is most of them. We can begin up at the top with the Sioux and the South Dakota Crow Creek Reservation. This was a study done in 1928 by two University of Chicago economists, actually home economists, which is kind of what they called nutritionists back then. And they described the conditions on the Sioux Reservation as basically being so poor as to be beyond imagination in 1928. So they lived 4 to 8 people in a room. They had no running water. They had no indoor plumbing. They got most of their food from government rations. And yet, 40% of the women, 10% of the men, and a quarter of the children were distinctly fat. And 20% of the women, 25% of the children were extremely thin. So this is a combination of obesity and undernutrition and malnutrition in the same population that's now known as a dual or double burden of obesity and malnutrition. And we'll get back to it shortly, because I think it's a vital observation. There were definitely signs of deficiency disease in this population. The kids were stunted. So these Native Americans were not just getting not enough vitamins and minerals, but also not enough food. If we come down to 61, 63, Trinidad was having a deficiency, a malnutrition crisis on the island, and the US government sends a team of nutritionists down to check it out and to help, and they come back reporting that 1/3 of the women over 25 are obese, and that obesity is a potentially serious medical problem in women. And the next year, an MIT nutritionist goes down to Trinidad and quantifies the diet being consumed and reports that the per capita daily diet was less than 2,000 calories, very low fat, and were fewer calories than were recommended at the time by the Food and Agriculture Organization for a healthy diet. So the question I want you to be asking yourself, here's a population in, get back here, Trinidad, extremely poor. Okay, malnutrition everywhere, and yet these very explosive levels of obesity. How is that possible? Here are some more studies. Bantu pensioners in South Africa in 64, 65. This is the poorest of a disenfranchised black population during the apartheid era in South Africa. The mean weight of women over 60 was 165 pounds. That's roughly the mean weight of women in the US today. 30% were severely overweight. Chilean factory workers in 74. Okay, these people are working, most engaged in heavy labor. They're working on construction lines and factories in Chile. So they may not be power walking or training for marathons or have gym memberships. But we could be pretty confident that these are really physically active people. 30% are obese, 10% are undernourished, that combination of obesity and malnutrition in the same population. And nearly 50% of the women over 54 are obese. And then this population, Mexican Americans in Starr County, Texas. This was a study done by University of Texas cardiologists. Starr County is on the border of Mexico, about 200 miles due south of San Antonio. Most of the inhabitants are employed in agricultural labor and or work in the oil field. So again, this is a poor, hardworking population. 50% of the women in their 50s are obese and 40% of the men in their 40s. These are numbers similar to what we have in the United States today. And there was one restaurant in Starr County, Texas in 1980. okay, a Mexican restaurant. So there was none of this toxic environment, none of this cheese curls and potato chips. No kids are being kept home from school. No one's got TVs or iPads or computers. They're physically active, hardworking, poor people, and they are fat. And the question is why? Okay, before I go on, here's one more modern example of obesity, this double burden. This is refugees, Western Saharan refugees, was published 2012. They're living in refugee camps in the Sahara Desert in Algeria. All their food is trucked in by international food aid organizations. They are as poor, literally as poor as dirt. 28% of the households have obese mothers, female adult figures living with undernourished or malnourished children. So why are these populations fat? Because I believe if we know why they're fat, we will know why our populations are fat. I believe in something called Occam's razor, which the gist of it is, let's stick with the simple hypothesis that explains everything before we have to complicate it. So here's how this problem was described in 1973 by Ralph Richards. Richards was a British-trained diabetes specialist who in the early 1960s went to Jamaica and opened up a diabetes clinic in the University of the West Indies. In 1973, he comes to London to a conference on obesity, and he reports that 2/3 of the adult women in Jamaica are obese, 2/3. And he says it's difficult to explain the high frequency of obesity seen in a relatively impecunious society, it's a poor society, such as exists in the West Indies when compared to the standard of living enjoyed in the more developed countries. He's asking the same question I'm asking. We expect rich countries and their prosperity to cause obesity. They have all this food. They don't have to be physically active. They don't have to work for a living. But you've got this incredible poverty in Jamaica combined with incredible obesity. Malnutrition and subnutrition are common disorders in the first 2 years of life. Subnutrition continues in early childhood to the early teens. Obesity begins to manifest itself in the female population from the 25th year of life and reaches enormous proportions from 30 onward. And what's interesting is back in the 1970s, I learned obesity at the time used to be considered by most nutritionists a kind of malnutrition. So if you think of it as a malnutrition, you're saying something's wrong with the food supply. We don't know what it is. If you think of it as overnutrition, you're basically saying people are eating too much and exercising too little. Something's wrong with the people. We don't know what it is. But they didn't see it as overnutrition yet. That came later. So here's what happens once the overnutrition paradigm comes in, this overeating paradigm. This is Benjamin Caballero, runs a laboratory for human nutrition at Hopkins, writing an article on this paradox of obesity and malnutrition in the New England Journal of Medicine. And he says, a few years ago, I was visiting a primary care clinic in the slums of Sao Paulo, Brazil. The waiting room was full of mothers with thin, stunted young children exhibiting the typical signs of chronic undernutrition. Their appearance sadly would surprise few who visit poor urban areas in the developing world. What might come as a surprise that many of the mothers holding those undernourished infants were themselves overweight. Then he says the coexistence of underweight and overweight poses a challenge to public health programs, since the aims of programs to reduce undernutrition, which make more food available, right, are obviously in conflict with those for obesity prevention, which is make less food available. So I put this phrase, poses a challenge to public health programs, in bold italics, because this coexistence of underweight and overweight doesn't pose a challenge to your public health programs, it poses a challenge to your paradigms. Okay, if you believe that those obese mothers got fat because they merely took in superfluous calories that their bodies didn't need to burn for energy, you then have to ask yourself, why weren't those mothers giving those superfluous calories to their starving children? Okay? The existence of the malnourished, undernourished, stunted children say the kids aren't getting enough food, but we have a hypothesis of obesity that says that the mothers got fat because they ate too much food. And we also have a paradigm of maternal behavior that says mothers will starve so that their children can eat, not that mothers will sneak outside and eat in a Snickers bar while their kids are inside the hut starving. So you pretty much have to throw out, normally when I give this talk, it's not to students, and I could say, how many mothers are there in the audience? How many of you would let your child starve so you can eat a Snickers bar? That's what we're talking about with the overnutrition paradigm. What I'm saying is these two paradigms are in contradiction. You got to get rid of one of them. And because I had a mother, may she rest in peace, I'm going to try to get rid of the obesity paradigm. And another way to look at this is, I want an explanation of obesity that can explain this. without having to put a lot of epicycles on it. I want to know why these starving women are fat and their children are starving or malnourished or undernourished. And I want my hypothesis of obesity to explain that. If it can't do it, it is not very intellectually satisfying because this is a serious problem in the world. Okay, here's more reasons to question the energy balance hypothesis. If eating too much causes obesity, eating less should be able to reduce it, okay? You don't get fat all at once. Nobody wakes up obese, okay? I mean, there's some genetic problems, some hypothalamic lesions. You could get people fat pretty quickly. But for the most part, 1 year you're 5 pounds overweight, then you're 10 pounds, then you're 20. Somewhere along the way, you should be able to say, hey, I'm getting fatter. I should be able to eat less and reverse it. And if people don't get fat or don't get leaner, there's still an obesity epidemic. That's pretty good evidence that this doesn't work. If you look at the clinical trials, the review data, I like to use a Cochrane collaboration because they have an unbiased methodology. Weight loss achieved in trials of calorie-restricted diets is so small as to be clinically insignificant. This has been known, studied since the 1940s. It's always been known. I mean, one way to think of this, Hilda Brooke, who was the leading authority on childhood obesity in the US, in the mid-1950s, she had a clinic at Columbia, the first childhood pediatric obesity clinic in the country, said that more than in any other illness, a physician treating the obese patient is called upon only to do a special trick to make the patient do something, stop eating after it has already been proved that he cannot do it. Everyone who's obese, everyone who's overweight knows they're supposed to eat less. If they remain obese and overweight, somehow that intervention has failed. The other problem, though, is exercising more doesn't work, or at least burning more calories, increasing your energy expenditure. And I could give you references, the meta-analyses that show how small the effect is of just adding exercise. They're very difficult studies to do well anyway. But this is, I find this more compelling. In 2007, the American Heart Association, the American College of Sports Medicine put out, published joint physical activity guidelines. These are people who believe that physical activity is an inherent part of a healthy lifestyle, as do I, okay? But you'd expect them to spin the data to make you think physical activity is even more beneficial than it is. But this is what they said about this idea that increasing expenditure will make you leaner. It's reasonable to assume that persons with relatively high daily energy expenditures would be less likely to gain weight over time compared with those who have low energy expenditures, which is logically equivalent to saying if I'm a couch potato, it's reasonable to conclude that I'll be less likely to gain fat if I become a marathon runner than if I remain a couch potato. And then they said, so far, data to support this hypothesis are not particularly compelling. And what's fascinating is this hypothesis is 100, maybe 150 years old, depending on how you want to date it. And if the best you can say about a hypothesis after 100 to 150 years of testing is that the data to support it are not particularly compelling, and that's from proponents of physical activity as a healthy adjunct to a lifestyle, I want you to consider the possibility that maybe the hypothesis is not correct. Maybe increasing energy expenditure doesn't lead to weight loss. So here's one reason to think why it might not. Here's a thought experiment, a Gedanken experiment. Imagine that tonight, after the lecture, we're hosting a dinner, one of the dean's homes, and we have the 10 best chefs from upstate New York cooking at the dinner. Okay, it's like Top Chef on steroids. There's going to be course after course after course of the best food you've ever tasted in your life. How many of you have ever watched Top Chef where you think, how can they just keep eating? You know? But that's what it's going to be. So we send you an invitation. Every one of you got an invitation. In the invitation, it described how wondrous this feast was going to be. And then it said, come hungry. Bring your appetite. What would you do to make sure that when you got to this house tonight, you were capable of eating as much food as humanly possible? Exercise. I'd work out today. If I normally do a half hour, I maybe do an hour or 2 hours. I might even walk. It's only 5 miles. Let's walk to dinner. Let's build up an appetite. Remember that concept? And I might also eat less during the day. Skip lunch or eat a smaller lunch. I'm certainly not having an afternoon snack. I'm going to eat less and exercise more, and that's going to assure that I'm as hungry as humanly possible when I get to the house. And the exact same advice we give obese people to lose weight is the advice that any of the rest of us would take to make sure we were hungry. Does that strike you as a little perverse? Do you begin to see the problem with this hypothesis, this way of thinking? Okay, here's another problem. This is the energy balance challenge. The CDC says weight management is all about balance, balancing the number of calories you consume with the number of calories your body uses or burns off. Okay, so we can ask the simple question, what does that entail? So let's imagine that I'm lean in my 20s, like most of you guys are, and I want to stay lean through my 40s, so I don't want to gain 2 pounds a year. Because if I gain 2 pounds a year, that's 20 pounds in 10 years, it's 40 pounds in 20 years. Okay? So the question is, how many closely do I have to balance, do this balancing thing, calories in to calories out, to make sure that I don't gain 2 pounds a year and become obese in my 40s? So it's simple mathematics. Typical adult's food intake is 2,700 calories a day. By the way, the calculation I'm going to show you, I first read in a 1937 nutrition and metabolism textbook by the leading authority on metabolism in the US at the time, a guy named Eugene Dubois. And he made this calculation for the very same reason I'm doing it. So 2,700 calories a day, it's about 1 million calories a year, it's about 10 million calories in a decade. It's about 10 to 12 tons of food. Okay, so now you want to know how accurately do I have to balance calories in to calories out to gain no more than 20 pounds over a decade, 40 pounds in 20 years? And the answer is to 21 calories a day. If I stick 21 calories in my fat tissue that I do not burn every day, so every day I eat about, I'm a big guy, I eat about 3,000 calories. If 21 of those ends up in my fat tissue, let's say I burn off 2,980 of them, and the remaining 20 end up in my fat tissue, I'm going to end up obese. Here's the calculation. 20 calories a day, it's 8th grade math, times 365 days in a year, times 10 years, divided by 3,500 calories per pound of fat. 21 pounds in a decade. How is it possible? It's 0.8% accuracy, balancing calories into calories out. And if you have half that number of calories, 10 calories a day stored in your fat tissue but not burned, you're going to gain 10 pounds every decade. Okay? If you want to stay in energy balance, if this is what you have to do to not get fat, you have to burn off every last calorie you expend. How do you do that? Okay, how is it possible? This is what Dubois said, considering this number, how small the accumulation has to be to produce obesity over a short period of time. There's no stranger phenomenon, the maintenance of a constant body weight under marked variation in bodily activity and food consumption. If you go on in life to study as a researcher what food signals from the gut might affect satiety, and make you satiated earlier, they have to affect satiety before your fat tissue gets 20 calories a day. One bite of food. Let's say, again, 3,000 calories is what I probably eat. That might be 150 swallows of food a day. 149 of them I burn off. The 150th ends up in my fat tissue. I end up fat. So here's another way to think about it. What if my fat tissue had some kind of dysregulation? So as fat went into it every day, it held on to 20 calories that it didn't let out. So now the question is, what could be wrong with my fat tissue that every day it holds on to a tiny, subtle, insignificant amount of calories and won't release it? Kind of easier to imagine how that could happen than how we could somehow consciously or unconsciously balance this equation. So now I have to apologize. I'm going to be showing some photos of naked human beings. These photos come from pre-World War II German language textbooks, some of them English language translations. Pre-World War II, this is one of the things I learned in my research. Pre-World War II, all meaningful medical research was done in Europe, primarily by Germans and Austrians. They kind of honed science, medical science, to a fine edge. The lingua franca of science pre-World War II was German. The war came and all of this was lost. The lingua franca switches to English. But pre-World War II, the Germans and Austrians thought very valuable to actually look at photos of fat patients, to deal with patients, not rats, not mice, not even Siberian hamsters, but to actually deal with obese patients and look at not just whether they're fat or not. If you look at BMI, it only measures, are you fat? BMI over 30, are you not? They want to know, what about where fat accumulates and when fat accumulates? Because if you want a theory of obesity, as I do, that explains why some people get fat in their 40s and others in their 20s, why some people are born fat, why men and women fatten differently, it helps to pay attention to these things. So we could start with genetics. We know that obesity is a huge genetic component, But here's a lean pair of identical twins, and here's an obese pair of identical twins. And our calories in, calories out idea might explain why these women are fat and these are relatively lean, because these women took in too many calories and these women perfectly balanced caloric intake with expenditure. But our hypothesis doesn't tell anything about why they have the exact same body. So identical twins don't just have the same faces, they tend to have the same body types, right? So why does the fat go to the exact same places on this woman? You know, why aren't they fat entirely different? Men and women fat entirely different. What regulates that? And what does our calories hypothesis have to say about where the fat goes? And we all have some place we know the fat goes and it bothers us. But why does it go there instead of somewhere else? What does calories say about it? Here's another way to look at that same issue with animal husbandry. Again, this was a pre-World War II example. This Jersey cow is a lean dairy cow. You can see the swollen udder. You can see how lean it is, the ribs showing. And the Aberdeen Angus is a stocky beef cow. You could see the intramuscular meat accumulated. And you could ask the question, we know it's genetic because they're different breeds of cattle, right? What do the genes control? Okay, do they control how much these animals eat and exercise? Like how many bites of grass this animal takes in after 10 hours? Because this one does, 1,400 bites and this does 1,200, or this number of calories per bite, or maybe how much they exercise, like it gets dark out, this one goes for a jog, like the old Far Side cartoons, and this one goes into the barn and watches television. There's something obviously problematic with the idea that the genes that control body fat, bulk in animals would be mediated through intake and expenditure. So here's another way to look at it. Imagine this animal, all ethical issues aside, what we have is somebody, we wanted to take in fuel here and convert it to milk. And this is incredibly energy expensive. We don't want that fuel accumulating as fat and protein here because that's just a waste. All we want to do is milk, or maybe the milk is so energy expensive that it's pulling the calories to the milk and not allowing it to accumulate here, like the equivalent of doing extreme physical activity. Whereas this animal, we want the calories to build up as fat and protein. So maybe the genes that control it aren't controlling how much they eat and exercise, how much fuel they take in or expend, but how that fuel is allocated, whether it's to milk, to fat, to protein. If we throw in a gazelle, it might be to physical activity. So maybe these are fuel allocation genes rather than intake and expenditure genes. And maybe that'll help us begin to understand this. Sexual variations. Men get fat above the waist, women get fat below the waist. Our calories in, calories out hypothesis tells us both these people consume too many calories. But what does it say about where they got fat? Why did the calories go here? This guy doubled his risk of obesity by getting fat up here. She didn't. What do the calories in, calories out have to do with it? Do we know, does that hypothesis tell us absolutely anything meaningful about why a man's fat cell in his abdomen will accumulate fat and a woman's won't? And the woman's fat cell below her waist will accumulate fat and the man's won't. Puberty is another good example. Boys and girls enter puberty with roughly the same amount of body fat. I think girls have something like 7% more. As they go through puberty, they both grow. They both get bigger. They take in more calories than they expend. The boys actually lose fat and gain muscle. And the girls gain fat and gain it in very specific places. Okay, they don't gain it everywhere. They gain it in places you could argue evolutionarily designed to drive the boys crazy. So the question is, what do the calories have to do with it? They both got bigger. We know they were both in positive energy balance. But the boys lost fat and gained muscle, and the girls gained fat and did it in specific places. Obviously, sex hormones are playing a huge role in whether or not fat is gained, where fat is gained, or muscle is gained. If this is a hormonal phenomenon, why do we blame obesity, just fat accumulation without puberty, on eating too much and exercising too little? And here's the last picture. By now, in my book, my editor was saying, Gary, your book is beginning to look like a freak show. Let's move it along. Lipodystrophy. A lipodystrophy is a disorder of fat accumulation. This one happens to be called progressive lipodystrophy. By the 1950s, there are about 200 cases on record, 80% of them in women. In these cases, the women begin to lose fat in their foreheads, subcutaneous fat. It moves downward, hence the term progressive. and often gets to the waist and then stops at the waist, and then you get lower body obesity sometimes developing afterwards, maybe years afterwards. So in this case, this woman had a BMI of about 34. She was technically obese, but all her body fat was localized below the waist. Okay? And the way these Germans and Austrians put it, they said, are we going to blame the top half on undereating and the bottom half on overeating? And if you can't blame localized emaciation or obesity on overeating and undereating, as this Gedanken experiment suggests, what right do we have to blame full body on this, on overeating? So if this woman had, say, 10 pounds excess more weight on her upper body, if the emaciation wasn't so clear that she has a lipodystrophy, she would still have a BMI of around 35. She'd go to the doctor, and the doctor would say, eat less and exercise more. I want a hypothesis of obesity that can explain this and this in the same human being. Okay, and it's very hard to do with the calories in, calories out idea. So where does this idea come from? Physics, basically. When I lectured to cardiologists a few months ago, I said, why is it that of all the disorders you will see, from the day you get into med school to the day you retire, the only one you will go to a physics book for advice on how to treat is obesity, which will be the most common one that you'll get. But physics, okay, so what about physics? The laws of thermodynamics supposedly dictate this is true. First law of thermodynamics, energy conservation. It's the easiest one to understand. It's pretty simple. It says energy is neither created nor destroyed, and because of that, it means if energy changes in a system, any system, whether a human being or a rodent or a star, if the energy goes up, then more energy has to go into it than leaves it, okay? The way it's communicated in this energy balance hypothesis on obesity, the idea is change in fat mass equals energy consumed minus energy expended. So this has to be true. It's a law of physics, okay? So what's the problem with this? There's no arrow of causality here. By that, this means it doesn't mean that change in energy of a system isn't caused by E in minus E out. It just says if this gets bigger, this has to get bigger. These things are equal. They're equivalent statements of the same fact. And what we did is we took an idea, and it happened in the early 19th century, back when the laws of thermodynamics were new and everybody was excited, and nutritionists were excited about studying calories and calorimetry. And we said, if this is true, therefore, if somebody eats more than they expend, then they have to get more massive, right? So they have to get fatter. So therefore, E in minus E out causes people to get fat. We turned an equation that has no causal information whatsoever, and we turned it into an explanation for obesity. So let me give you an idea how crazy this is. Suppose we want to know, instead of wanting to know why people get so fat, why they have so much energy in their fat tissue, we want to know why this room has so much energy in the form of people. Okay? So similar idea, people are conserved, and you say, Gary, why is this idea so crowded with people? Why is the energy expenditure gone, the energy in the room gone up from an hour ago? And I say, well, because more people entered the room than left. Okay, that's definitely true. But it tells you nothing about why this room got crowded. Okay, if a room gets crowded, more people are going to enter than leave. If somebody gets fat, they're going to take in more energy than they expend. Neither one of them says anything about why they get crowded. So why might this room have gotten crowded? Well, there's a lecturer in here who's giving a lecture, and there's a course scheduled, or maybe there was a party scheduled, or there's free food scheduled, or maybe the air conditioning broke outside and it's midsummer and this was the only room with air conditioning, so everybody fled in to get the cold air, or the sprinkler system went off out there and everybody came in here to get out of the water. Or maybe I had big bouncers standing at the doorways that are pulling people in, okay, who walk by and not letting them leave. And all those are explanations for why the room might be crowded, and they involve the conditions inside the room. You know, the air conditioning, the sprinklers, the lecture, free drinks, whatever, and the conditions outside the room and the difference between the two. So the temperature outside, no air conditioning, broken sprinklers, and the conditions at the boundary, the membrane, the bouncers who are pulling people. All of those are explanations. The fact that more people came in than left tells you nothing. If we were talking about wealth and you said, why is Bill Gates so rich? And I said, because he made more money than he spends, you would laugh me out of the room. If we were talking about climate change, said, Gary, why is the atmosphere heating up? And I said, because it took in more energy than it expended. let out, you'd laugh me out of the room. In obesity, we accepted this idea that you get obese because you take in more energy than you expend. It's literally crazy. If you get fat, you have to take in more energy than you expend. If you get fatter and heavier. The question is why? Just like if the atmosphere is heating up, it's got to be taking in more energy than it lets out. The question is why? This theory tells us nothing. Okay, so here's the alternative hypothesis. And by the way, I'm going to probably run a little late. I notice that as I get going, I start talking too much. Feel free to leave on time, or if you want to stay. I notice there's nothing much happening afterwards. Okay, there is an alternative hypothesis. It's a pre-World War II European hypothesis. I'll give you the history in a second. This hypothesis, obesity, it starts with first principles. Obesity is a sort of excess fat accumulation, okay? So right now we say obesity is sort of energy balance, calories in minus calories out. And what we study is what regulates how much people eat and exercise. If you say obesity is a sort of excess fat accumulation, the first question you might ask is what regulates fat accumulation? I know, but I bet a lot of you don't because you've never been taught that because it's never been considered relevant to human obesity, as I'll show you. Overeating and inactivity are compensatory effects, are not causes. I'll explain that shortly. We don't get fat because we overeat. We overeat because our fat tissue is accumulating excess fat. The first law, the direction of causality, the conventional wisdom is that changes in E in and E out drive changes in energy storage. And this alternative hypothesis says energy storage is very well regulated. If you dysregulate it, if you cause somebody to accumulate fat or lose fat, you will cause compensatory changes in E in and E out. So the arrow of causality is shifted. And I believe all science is about establishing causality. So I really want to know which way does it go, because if I know which way it goes, I can begin to deal with what has to be done to cure it or to prevent it. So here's an analogy, a growing child. This is an extremely young kid who now lives in Oakland, California. When he was 1 year old, he weighed 20 pounds. By the time he was 4 years old, he weighed 45 pounds. He'd gotten bigger, he'd gotten heavier, he'd gotten taller, he'd even gotten a little fatter. He'd taken in more calories than he expended, right? He'd been in positive energy balance that whole period. He had to be because he was getting bigger. But he didn't get bigger because he was eating more calories than he expended. He was eating more calories than he expended because he got bigger, and he got bigger because his pituitary gland was secreting growth hormone, which was stimulating insulin-like growth factor. Growth was a hormonal phenomenon. It is a hormonal phenomenon. And the energy imbalance is a sort of compensatory effect of the growth. If any of you who have children, the parents in the family know that when your kids go through growth spurts, they often seem to eat voraciously, like suddenly they're hungry all the time, and you turn to your spouse and go, boy, he must be growing, or she must be growing. And then they get to teenager, and they go through puberty, and all these changes are happening in their body, and they eat you out of house and home, and they lie around the house all day long. And these aren't why they're going through puberty. These are effects of going through puberty. Okay, and pathological analogy, cancer. Here's a tumor cell growing. Where is it? Well, here's it getting bigger, bigger, bigger. This tumor cell's in positive energy balance, right? It's taking in more energy than it expends. It's actually even upregulating receptors and insulin receptors so that it could take in as much energy as humanly possible. But that's not why it's growing. That's a result of growth. It's growing because it has these tumor suppressor genes that are broken. These oncogenes are broken, so it's being driven to unfettered growth, and taking in as much fuel as possible is what it's doing to make that growth possible. So the idea is maybe this hypothesis, maybe obesity is just like every other growth phenomenon. If you dysregulate the fat tissue so it wants to get fatter, the compensatory effect is going to be wanting to eat more, wanting to be less active. So this is a German-Austrian hypothesis. It dates to pre-World War II. The major proponents were Gustav von Bergmann, who was the leading German expert on clinical medicine, internal medicine, pre-World War II. Today, one of the most prestigious prizes of the German Society of Internal Medicine is the Gustav von Bergmann Award. He's no quack. And Julius Bauer was the leading authority in Austria, the University of Vienna, which was one of the great universities of the world, on genetics, chronic disease, endocrinology. And by 1940, this hypothesis was more or less fully accepted in Europe. And the problem is, I knew none of this, by the way, when I started my research. problem is 1940 was a very bad year for Europe. So the war has opened. Bauer fled Austria in 38. Hell breaks out for 10 years, and by the time the 1950s come and Europe's getting back on its feet, the whole science of obesity has been reconstituted basically at the Harvard School of Public Health, the Harvard School of Nutrition, and this whole European idea has kind of vanished. And the lingua franca of science during this period shifts from German to English. And nobody wants to read the German literature. And I actually documented this in my book. You could see the number of citations from the German literature between the one textbook published in 1940, where a third of the citations are from the German literature, to the next textbook in 1948, where 12 out of 600. You do the numbers. OK, so lipophilia. Lipophilia means love of... I'm going to keep going if you guys get... lipophilia means love of fat. And the idea that Bergman evoked the term to explain, to try and understand why some parts of the body are willing to embrace fat and others aren't, willing to sort of willingly fill up with fat and others aren't. And it came from an idea in the late 19th century. There was a young girl who had a bad burn on the back of her hand, so they grafted skin from her hand onto the back of her hand, skin from her gut onto the back of her hand. Then she grew up to be an adult, and by the time she was an adult, she was obese. Maybe I did that. Anyway, by the time she was an adult, she was obese. She had this huge tuft of fat on the back of her hand. And von Bergman said, this is fascinating. There's obviously something about, like if you look at the back of your hands, it's one of these places where you don't tend to store fat. And he said, why is it there are parts of the body, like obviously I could take skin from the abdomen, which does store fat, and attach it to the back of the hand, and now the back of my hand, the back of this girl's hand will store fat. There must be something. We'll never figure this out. Maybe if I did it. No, I didn't do it. OK. There must be something, some factors that move with the skin that control fat accumulation to some level. And he said, we don't get fat on our foreheads, we don't get fat on the back of our hands, we do get fat on our guts, just like, and they used hair as an example. So some people, we grow hair in some places, but not in others. And just as some people are hairier than others, some people are fatter than others, and they just assumed that this was all controlled by endocrine, central nervous system factors, and when they figured it out, they would understand what causes obesity. So this is how, I'm going to have to read this to you, this is how Bauer put it in 1929. He said, like a malignant tumor, like the fetus, the uterus, or the breasts of a pregnant woman, the abnormal lipophilic tissue seizes on foodstuffs, even in the case of undernutrition. So we can now begin to explain our obese women in a malnourished, undernourished society. If they have what he's calling lipophilic tissue, it doesn't matter whether there's enough food around, just like a tumor doesn't care if there's enough food around. It maintains its stock and may increase it independent of the requirements of the organism. A sort of anarchy exists. The adipose tissue lives for itself and does not fit into the precisely regulated management of the whole organism. So you can think of obesity as akin to a tumor, to a malignancy. It's got a mind of its own. It's being dysregulated to grow fatter. And then the question is why? And if you look at animal models of obesity, what you'll find in virtually every one I've ever found is that the animals will get fat whether or not they're calorie restricted, whether or not they're given enough food to overeat. And Jean Mayer phrased it this way. This wasn't his mouse. You can't really, I don't know if you can see it or not. Pardon me?
Basically see it.
OK. Jean Mayer was a leading nutritionist in the 1960s in the US, had a strain of fat mice he studied. And he said these mice will make fat out of their food under the most unlikely circumstances, even when half starved. So they don't get fat because they eat too much. They get fat if they eat at all. Okay? And that's one of the things we have to explain. How can you have an animal, if you can half starve the animal and it will still make fat, what does it mean to overeat? If you have somebody whose metabolism, a child whose metabolism is expending 500 calories a day, what does it mean if that kid's eating 600 calories and getting fatter? Does that mean he's overeating? It's a concept that you can only define if the person is actually fat, and then it's meaningless. So here's a question. If obesity is sort of excess fat accumulation, what regulates fat accumulation? This is taught to medical students in med school. If you guys, we're going to turn off the lights because I'm going to need the chart. So this is my 5-minute class in fat accumulation. This is, you'll see in endocrinology and biochemistry textbooks. The key thing to know is that fat in the human body comes in two forms that interest us, triglycerides and fatty acids. Here's a fatty acid. You bond it together with the glycerol molecule. You get this big thing called a triglyceride. So we store fat as triglycerides. I'll explain in a second. We burn them fatty acids for fuel. And fat enters and exits fat cells as fatty acids. And inside the fat cell, the fatty acids continually cycle into triglycerides and back out again. So here's a fat cell. I'm going to show you. This is what we care about. So you can think about your theory of obesity. What I want to know, I don't want to know how much somebody eats and exercises. If somebody's obese, they have too much fat in their fat cells. They have too many fat cells. So I want to know why they have so much fat in their fat cells. And that's where I care about the whole energy balance thing. You know, if more energy gets into the fat cell as triglycerides and gets out, this fat cell is getting fatter. And if more energy leaves the fat cell than gets in, this fat cell is getting leaner, and we're all the integration of all our fat cells. So we want to know what regulates the fat cell. And if you're being taught about obesity, I'm sure you're being taught about this. It's crucial. So fat comes to the fat cells in lipoproteins and triglycerides and lipoproteins. And then there's these enzymes called lipoprotein lipase that basically simplistically reach out into the bloodstream and break down the triglycerides into fatty acids. And the fatty acids flow into the fat cell. And then in the fat cell, they're bound up with glycerol into triglycerides, and they're stored as triglycerides. And then there are hormones in the fat cell that break down the triglycerides into component fatty acids and the glycerols where they can get out again. And what's so cool about this system is the reason we transport them as fatty acids because the fatty acids are small enough to get through the fat cell membrane. And then once inside, once bound up into triglyceride, this thing is too big to get out. So you store fat as a triglyceride because it's trapped in here. If you want to get it out, you have to break it back down into its component parts. So anything that works to move fatty acids into the fat cell and bind them up as triglycerides will work to make that fat cell fatter and so you fatter. And anything that works to break the triglycerides down into fatty acids and glycerol and get them out will work to make that fat cell leaner and you leaner. So it's a pretty simple idea, and it's a fat cell-centric hypothesis of obesity. You just say, I want to know what makes a fat cell fatter, and if I can figure that out, I've probably got it licked. So as it turns out, in the early mid-1950s, 3 research groups discovered ways to measure fatty acids in the bloodstream. That was in 1956. And in 1959, Rosalind Yalow and Solomon Burson published their radioimmunoassay. So for the first time in history, research can actually measure hormone levels in the bloodstream accurately. Yalow went on to win the Nobel Prize for that work. Burson had died by then. It was the major revolution in endocrinology, probably one of the biggest, the greatest discoveries in the history of endocrinology. And by the early 1960s, it was pretty clear that the hormone insulin, as Yalow and Burson put it, was the principal regulator of fat metabolism. Oh, man. Okay, can you guys see this vaguely? The key thing, here's your fat cell, insulin, and this is from a 2010 textbook, Metabolic Regulation by Keith Frayne at Oxford. He's the world's leading authority on this stuff. And you could see that when it comes to putting fat in fat cells, it's insulin, it's all insulin. And when it comes to getting fat out of fat cells, insulin inhibits that. Other hormones work a little bit to get fat out of fat cells. But basically, as Yalow and Burson said, insulin's the primary regulator. And if you look at the suppression of fat mobilization, what keeps fat in fat cells, as Yalow and Burson said, the release of fatty acids requires only the negative stimulus of insulin deficiency. So by the mid-1960s, the hypothesis of obesity could have been, arguably should have been, that anything that elevates insulin is going to make you fatter. Okay, and if you want to get people lean, you don't force them to run and force them to starve. You figure out what you can do to get their insulin levels as low as possible. And as you can see, this is just to show you circa 2001 textbook. The effect of insulin on fat storage. This is a young woman who got type 1 diabetes when she was 17, and for the next half century she gave herself her 2 insulin shots in her thigh, and she ends up with these huge fat masses. And this photo is used in this textbook, Endocrinology and Integrated Approach, to illustrate a box on the action of insulin on the adipocyte, which is to stimulate fat storage and inhibit mobilization. The remarkable effects of locally injected insulin, you know, on the accumulation of fat fat into triglyceride, into adipocytes are graphically illustrated here. And you could argue that what we did to the country for the past 50 years is what this woman did to her thighs. We somehow gradually raised insulin levels. This is your alternative hypothesis, which caused increased fat storage. So the key points of fat cell regulation. When insulin is secreted or chronically elevated, fat accumulates in the fat tissue. That's conventional wisdom. It's in the textbooks. There's nothing controversial about that. When insulin levels drop, fat escapes from the fat tissue, and that's also conventional wisdom. It's just sort of classic biochemistry, endocrinology. And we secrete insulin primarily in response to the carbohydrates in our diet. So that's also conventional wisdom. And the way this was described to me is by George Cahill, was a leading authority in the subject at Harvard in the 60s. He co-edited a textbook, 500-page monograph published by the American Society of Physiology on this science. And the way Cahill described it to me was carbohydrate is driving insulin and is driving fat. So that's conventional medicine. And that's what's taught to medical students. If you remove these three words as driving insulin, you have carbohydrate is driving fat, which is logically equivalent, and now you're in quackery land. Okay? As soon as you take out is driving insulin and you say carbohydrate is driving fat, you're at the Atkins diet. And when I give this lecture to medical schools, often the doctors will be with me and they'll be nodding and nodding and nodding, and I'll get to this line and I'll take out this driving insulin and they'll go, oh my God, it's the Atkins diet, he's a quack. Okay, we've been fooled. He seems so intelligent, but he's not. What's the game? Carbohydrate is driving. The problem is our energy balance hypothesis also implies that a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. The only thing that affects fat accumulation is the caloric content of the foods we consume or how much of those calories were digested. It doesn't allow for any particular macronutrient the opportunity to be uniquely fattening. But once you embrace this biochemical, physiological, endocrinological hypothesis, you end up with this idea that, hey, maybe carbohydrates are fattening. And what happened in the 60s is fascinating, and I document this in my book. Physicians read the same literature I did, the medical literature. They say insulin's driving fat. How can we design a diet to minimize insulin levels? So the way to do it is to lower carbohydrates and increase fat as high as you can, because fat is the one macronutrient that doesn't promote insulin response. So you end up with this very low carbohydrate, high fat diet. And they started applying it to patients, and they found, hey, this works great. Usually they tried it first, and this works great. I lose weight effortlessly. And then they wrote books about it because it works so great on their patients. Why not tell the world and make a little money? And the book sold like hotcakes. And they drove the medical community crazy. Because the medical community at the time was trying to convince everyone that dietary fat caused heart disease. And that's always been the rub. If a high-fat, high-saturated fat diet causes heart disease, we don't care whether a high-fat diet makes you leaner because you're killing yourself. So by the mid to late 1970s, especially after Atkins came along, all this science had been thrown out. I have a different lecture. I have a baby in a bathwater image. These people wanted to get rid of Atkins. They thought he was killing people. And in order to get rid of Atkins, you had to get rid of the science base of a low-carb, high-fat diet. And this is, in effect, the science base. So by the late 1970s, discussions of obesity in the obesity conferences never talked about the hormonal regulation of fat accumulation. And you could find it today. I have friends who wrote books about obesity, disorder of excess fat accumulation, in which there's no discussion of what hormones and enzymes work to put fat in the fat cell. It'd be like writing a book about the cause of cancer without ever mentioning oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes and all the other genes, or cigarettes for that fact. Okay, so here's how you see it. This is how it plays out. This is Leninger's Principles of Biochemistry. You could go to the biochemistry books today, or endocrinology textbooks. I could have shown you a similar slide from Williams' textbook of endocrinology. You go to adipocyte in the index, which is a word for fat cell, and you go to where it talks about what makes fat cells fat, what makes fat tissues fat, and this is what it says. High blood glucose, which you get from a carb-rich diet or being a type 2 diabetic, elicits a release of insulin, which speeds the uptake of glucose by tissues, favors the storage of fuels as glycogen, which is the storage form of carbohydrates, and triglycerols, while inhibiting fatty acid mobilization in adipose tissue. So what makes a fat cell fat? High blood glucose stimulating insulin release. What makes people fat? To a first approximation, obesity is a result of taking in more calories than are expended. These are two entirely different paradigms. This one is so powerful that even the people who wrote this textbook didn't realize that they were giving a different hypothesis for why a fat cell gets fat than why a human gets fat. And I'm just saying it's the same thing because we are the compilation of all our fat cells. So here's the alternative hypothesis. Like any growth defect, obesity is a hormonal regulatory disorder. So like any growth defect, if somebody walks in the door and they're 8 feet tall, we don't care about how much they ate or exercised, even if they weigh 500 pounds. We care about the tumor in their pituitary gland that's getting them to oversecrete growth hormone. Okay? Like type 2 diabetes, it's fundamentally a disorder of insulin signaling. In fact, these two are, obesity and diabetes are so closely associated that some people have come to calling it diabesity, and it's triggered by the carbohydrate content of the diet. Now, not just any carbs, okay? What we care about are the carbohydrates that promote excess insulin secretion, not the green leafy vegetables. Two groups in particular, the high glycemic index carbs, bread, cereal, rice, and pasta, which happen to be the base of the food guide pyramid that we were taught to eat 8 to 11 servings a day, which might begin to give us some insight into the obesity epidemic. As my wife would say, I'm just saying. And sweets, okay? Sugars, which are, fructose, glucose mixtures. If fructose is metabolized preferentially in the liver, it has an entirely, it's conceivable. I think the data are arguably compelling that fructose sugars could be the cause of insulin resistance. Now you could ask the question, so here's the alternative hypothesis. We saw when we started the original hypothesis, which was overeating, calories in over calories out. This one's refined grains, starches, and sugars drive up insulin secretion, which causes excess fat accumulation, obesity in the obesity epidemic. And you could ask this question, should this be surprising? This is one of my favorite sentences. It was the first sentence of an article in the British Journal of Nutrition in 1963 by one of the two leading British dietitians. Every woman knows that carbohydrates are fattening. This is a piece of common knowledge which few nutritionists would dispute. Okay? And then we decided dietary fat causes heart disease. And so you got to tell people to eat less fat, and you tell them to eat more carbohydrates, and end up with the food guide pyramid. And there's a report out of the UK in the mid-'80s where they say now we have to convince people to eat more carbs after we've been telling them to eat less carbs for 20 years because it'll make them fat. How are we going to do that? What's fascinating is back in the late 40s to early 50s, I found 4 diets for obesity published in medical journals by Harvard Medical School, Cornell Medical School, Stanford Medical School, and Northwestern. Reasonably good schools, and they were all identical to this one published by Raymond Green in the Practice of Endocrinology. This was the seminal British endocrinology textbook. Raymond Green was Graham Greene's brother, smart guy, and they were all this diet. And so foods to be avoided. Bread and everything else made with flour, cereals, potatoes, all other white root veg foods containing much sugar, all sweet. So this is the base of the food guide pyramid plus sugar. And you can eat as much as you like of the following foods. By the way, Lua, this is the advice, okay? In the book, I say you don't have to read the book, just tape this to your refrigerator. You can eat as much as you like of the following: meat, fish, birds, all green vegetables, eggs, cheese, fruit except bananas and grapes. With the exception of a little bit of the fruit, this was the Atkins diet. Okay, and what's fascinating is it didn't say you should eat 17% protein, and it didn't say you can eat as much as you like of this, because the idea is obesity wasn't caused by eating too much. It was caused by these foods. Don't eat them. And you could eat as much as you want because they don't have the characteristic of stimulating fat accumulation, and Green didn't know it at the time, and that characteristic arguably is that they stimulate insulin secretion or insulin resistance. So now the question is, what happens if you actually put people on these diets? Because that's always been the argument. Back when I wrote about this first, before I even understood the history in 2002, I ended my article saying, I'm eating this way and I'm basically waiting for my heart attack. If you tell people to eat very few carbs and a lot of fat and a lot of saturated fat, it's supposed to give them heart disease, but we now have dozens and dozens of studies. So this is a systematic review that was published a couple years ago. 23 reports, 17 clinical investigations, 1,140 obese patients. The low carbohydrate diet was associated with significant decreases in body weight, body mass index, abdominal circumference, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, triglycerides, plasma glucose, glycated hemoglobin, plasma insulin, C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory molecule, and an increase in high-density lipoprotein cholesterol. So everything gets better when you remove the refined grains and sugars, easily digestible carbs, and replace them with fat, even saturated fat, as you would expect from the history and then chronological literature. And then, of course, they had to say, however, the effects of a long-term health are unknown because you don't do clinical trials for 20 years. You only do them for 1 or 2. So here are my conclusions. Obesity is a sort of fat accumulation, not energy balance, not overeating. And I don't think that can be argued with. It's certainly a disorder of fat accumulation. Fat accumulation is regulated fundamentally by insulin and carbohydrates. As George Cahill said, carbohydrates driving insulin is driving fat. I think that's conventional wisdom. And here we verge into, alternative hypothesis quackery land. The solution to obesity and the obesity epidemic is not getting people to move more and eat less, but restricting the causative agent, i.e. the refined grains and sugars. So if you don't want people to get lung cancer, you don't tell them to eat less and move more. You tell them to quit smoking, because we know that cigarettes cause lung cancer. And I'm arguing that these foods literally cause obesity. They literally make people accumulate excess fat. And if you want them not to accumulate excess fat, they are the foods that you don't eat. I think that's it. Oh, one more slide. We asked the question earlier, why were those populations fat? I wanted a theory of obesity that can explain it. Most third world, this was Ralph Richards again in 1973. Most third world countries have a high carbohydrate intake as their economic dependence is predominantly agricultural, with a heavy dependence on non-dairy produces. It's conceivable that the ready availability of starch and preference to animal protein, contributing as a must to the main caloric requirements, leads to increased lipogenesis. That's the key word. It doesn't say it leads to them eating more or exercising less. It leads to the increased fat creation and the development of obesity. So thank you very much for your patience.